time, but maybe you're misremembering. The background music suddenly isn't so sure. You then find a staggeringly long stairway leading down into the abyss, just waiting to swallow you. This isn't the cockpit, but you hesitantly follow it down. What is going on here? Finally, you find the door to the cockpit, except... This isn't right. You've got to go back. Oh. A hungry expanse of nothing pins you to this tiny, rusted ledge. You only have one real choice. It's wet. You feel your socks and boots become tight, heavy mouths around your toes and ankles as you clumsily stumble your way through this sea of ethereal bile. Suddenly, the stars come out. You can see the cosmos and every manner of celestial breath filling the heavens, and for a moment, it's kinda lovely. It's terrifying, but somehow okay. You keep going, and then primal questions fly up your brainstem. What is that? Where is that? You start looking around, but where the hell is it? You hear something other than your footsteps in the water. What the hell is it? You do the only thing you can and run. Sirens blare, screens materialize in the air, metal scraps erupt from the water. The thing gets louder as you desperately run for your life.
Mom, what are you doing?
Raise your hand if this has ever happened to you before. You open a door in a video game and there is something completely impossible behind it. A dark void, the room you just left, a hallway that is a hall not this way. Maybe you've turned around and suddenly something is there now that wasn't there before. Maybe the entire landscape has seamlessly changed. Maybe you catch something out of the corner of your eye and it makes you become a little smaller in your seat. Maybe the game whispers something to you and you...
Yeah. Call the police.
These are all examples of ways that video games specifically make us feel like we're hallucinating. It could be an outright fever dream, a nightmare, a surreal dream sequence. These kinds of moments serve the purpose of giving you an intimate glimpse into your character's crumbling psyche. Typically you see them in horror games, but you'll certainly find them elsewhere, and I am kind of enamored with them. Sometimes they're skin-crawling explorations of a character's repressed trauma. Other times they're harrowing warnings of evil yet to come. Sometimes they're strangely beautiful. Sometimes they're that scene from Happy Gilmore. Oh, God! What I'd like to do today is break them down piece by piece.
Call the police.
Moments not just from video games, but also cinema and television and animation. What can they learn from one another? Why do they make you squirm? How can they make you laugh? When do they become something more than just horrific imagery? As you saw at the start, there is so much more to this than just showing us something spooky and then smash cutting to someone waking up in a cold sweat. I want to talk to you about the subtle methods that these sequences use to quietly slip under your skin and invade your subconscious until your bones itch. If that sounds fun, or not fun, then get cozy. Know that any spoilers today will be purely visual. I'm not digging too deeply into any plots, and also, there will be no jump scares. There will, however, be, perhaps, the opportunity of a lifetime. Working is a part of life. You need a paycheck to fund your basic needs: food, shelter, electricity, more Magic the Gathering cards if you're like me. But what if working was just as fulfilling and confidence building as your favorite game? The folks at Boot.dev have dared to ask this question. If you've ever been even a little bit interested in coding, it could be the career for you, and it could start here. Boot.dev is perhaps the smartest way to learn back-end web development in the Python and Go programming languages because it overcomes the largest problem in online learning: boredom. They use tactics from modern game design to keep you engaged and constantly discovering new concepts and techniques. Lessons are formatted like an RPG. You'll earn XP, levels, achievements, and complete quests. Heck, there are even bi-monthly boss fights where the community comes together to earn bonus XP. And the community is a big part of this as well. It's easier to learn when there are others involved. If you have questions or need to bounce ideas off someone, there is an active boot.dev Discord just waiting to welcome you. It's honestly an incredible little thing that they've built here, and if you're hesitant, no worries. Go take a free demo of some of the courses, or pay for it and enjoy a 30-day no questions asked refund policy. This is no get-rich-quick scheme. Boot.dev takes the time to truly go in depth and prepare you for a career. This could be a big moment for you. To take the first step on your journey, go to boot.dev and use my code DarylTalksGames to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. This is one of my favorite sponsors because I really believe in what they're doing over there. Thanks again to boot.dev. Now back to the show. That sequence we opened the video with is one of the early hallucinations in a game called Mouthwashing, and to me, it's kind of the blueprint for what most video game fever dreams do. It makes you feel like you're losing grip on reality by using a handful of tried and true techniques that you'll find across all of storytelling. We'll get to each of them and then eventually into some other techniques, but the first of these is environmental irregularities, when the space you were in is behaving suspiciously. And we see this all over the place. PT is famous for the whole repeating room bit, where each time you exit this room through this door, somehow you end up back at the entrance again, despite this going against the laws of physics. Clearly, this whole jaunt is metaphysical in nature. You'll find no shortage of nightmarish architecture in the horror genre. You get that same repeated room sequence in Silent Hill: The Short Message and My Side. In fact, My Side has a ton of structural tomfoolery. Endless foyers, hallways that expand the further you walk through them, rearranging rooms that have not loaded. Now, it's worth mentioning that you aren't exactly dreaming or hallucinating here. Your character is trapped in a video game, hence the loading screen, but techniques like this have been used all over gaming for years to disorient you when you play and make it very clear that your character has lost their marbles. And this is one area where video games might have a little bit more creative room. How many doors do you walk through in any given game? 10, 20, 100? At some point, there is an established expectation that when you open one, something that makes sense will be on the other side. But with cinema, typically these visions give themselves away early because only now is it important that you see this person nap. Only now is it important that we see this door in the background of a restroom that will suddenly lead into a completely different place than it did before. Spatial silliness, I'm gonna find every possible way to say this differently. Floor plan shenanigans accomplishes the same goal in both cases here, but in a game, there is an extra layer of habituation that creates a deeper shock value when a place you think you know well is behaving in a way it shouldn't. And the same goes with music. Games have taught us that background music is there to match the activity we're doing and tell us what to feel. If we're solving puzzles in the desert, it should sound like this. If we're in the corporate supervillain's headquarters, it should sound like this. If we're running errands on a space freighter, it should sound like this. So when that music begins to miss a few notes and loses tempo, what exactly are we doing now? How should this make us feel? You see, dream sequences typically use their music to send you in one of two directions, either directly into the teeth of the nightmare or ejecting you from the nightmare. You've seen the latter plenty of times. Things are slowly getting more and more uncanny. The camera does that Hitchcock zoom, or cuts rapidly between the imagery, or slowly pans on the horrifying thing and the music gets louder and shriller until there is a relief there just after the crescendo that replicates what waking up from a real nightmare is like. It's a ripping of the band-aid, and it signals the climax of the sequence. The other direction, into the dream, is much more subtle. It's in Doki Doki Literature Club when the notes begin to get glitchy and fall off beat. It's in The Punisher when the song slowly sours as this sweet delusion goes drastically wrong. It's going from no music to a subtle, eerie track that begins to echo a horrifying realization. The music that signals the beginning of the sequence is unsettling in a completely different way than the crescendo, because it's not offering relief from the nightmare, but instead introducing you to it, and now calling to question everything you see from this moment on. I always go back to that scene from House MD when House realizes that he's been hallucinating, which completely recontextualizes how he spent his last 48 hours. This is not a wake up, it was all a dream tool, it is a you can no longer trust what's in front of you tool. And I think that's why music that sends you into the dream is so unsettling to come across, because there is a betrayal that takes place when the story suddenly calls to question what you're experiencing. It creates a lingering pit in your stomach, which is totally different from the panicked relief of being ripped from some hyper-violent vision. And the importance of that relief can't be understated. Because as fun as it is to have these big bombastic dream sequences with otherworldly visuals, if a story is chock full of them from beginning to end, well, that could destroy its ability to truly affect you. The Scarecrow sequence in Batman Arkham Asylum works as well as it does because it's completely unexpected. The glitch and shifting perspective and the game over are so memorable for the same reasons as the nightmare sequence in Max Payne. You wouldn't be surprised at a sequence like this in a psychological horror game, but when this is a story that has thus far been completely based on reality and your expectation is that it's going to remain that way, these sequences are a welcome surprise and contrast the rest of the story beautifully. If the game is constantly throwing visions at you from the start, you might become numb to it. That's not to say you're not enjoying this bizarre world you're exploring, but it doesn't hotwire your mind quite like it would if it's used sparingly and carefully. There's an old interview with Quentin Tarantino where he mentions that confusion is a surefire way to rip you from a story unless you can trust that the film is going to resolve that confusion for you.
I know as a viewer, the minute I start getting confused, I check out of the movie. However, if you get confused, there's no problem with being momentarily confused if you feel you're in good hands.
And I think this is why experimental films like Black Moon, or The Science of Sleep, or Paprika, or even games like Hypnospace Outlaw and Hylix aren't for everyone. In many ways, they're kaleidoscopes that want to bask in their surrealism and allow you to interpret their meaning. They can rest their laurels on their gorgeous absurdity. And maybe they're not for you personally, but the value there as a viewer comes from wading through the confusion like a tie-dye puzzle, connecting the dots and constructing your interpretation. To me, these hallucinogenic parades of the impossible represent the highest setting on the dream sequence dial. But when storytellers turn that dial back down to a very low value and sneak these sequences in where they're least expected, that's when they have the ability to truly fray away at your grip on reality. When you're watching a movie and a dream sequence happens, there is usually a point at which you go, hang on, this has to be a dream. Where the stakes kind of crumble and you realize, no, this isn't really happening, and then you can safely view the remainder of it as a bystander, with the comfort that any moment now they'll wake up and this will be inconsequential. In most cases, you're right. I've always found myself most captivated when one of these scenes makes me work for that sentence, when the transition to that dream is so disguised and the imagery is so normal that I don't know it's a dream until right before they wake up. It's effectively had me under its spell for the duration of the nightmare, just like an actual nightmare does. And many scenes in both cinema and in gaming make it obvious intentionally and just let the vision do the work. It's clear in Twilight Princess that these chilling visuals aren't real because the camera pans in on Link closing his eyes, and then the Lanayru spirit begins telling him a story. In King Arthur, we get cuts between the dream and the dreamer, clearly indicating what you're looking at. This isn't wrong, by the way. The purpose here isn't to make you feel like you're dreaming or make you question what's real, it's to make it clear that this isn't, so that you can just look in as a passive viewer. But if the developers or the directors want to make you a participant, they disguise the beginning of these moments so that it's less obvious. Maybe instead of cutting from a sleeping person to the dream, we just open on a scene that feels pretty ordinary until later you realize it's all been a dream. Even better, at some point during a well-established scene, it silently becomes a dream unbeknownst to you and the dreamer. By far, my favorite example of this is in The Nice Guys. Ryan Gosling comments that he's getting sleepy and that he might need to pull over and let Russell Crowe drive. To which Russell responds,
"You don't have to pull over. The car can drive itself."
Ryan gives him a look, then takes his hands off the wheel. Sure enough, the car drives itself.
I didn't know it could do that.
He lights himself a cigarette, and then they begin talking about pollution with the giant bumblebee in the back seat.
Wake up! Wake up! March! Wake up!
I fucking love that movie. And while it's used for humor here, my god, it's smooth and tucked away. It slowly becomes more absurd, as dreams often do, but at first, it's just conceivable enough for you to go, huh, okay then. We usually don't remember falling asleep. It's called mesograde amnesia. It happens, and then we wake up confused an hour later on the couch. Since we never see Ryan Gosling pass out here, it translates like a regular flow of consciousness would. This setup is extremely effective at getting the viewer to say, oh, this is a dream, much later in the dream. There's a scene like this in Heavenly Delusion that had my heart rate doing backflips because it hid the lie just like this. And this is typically how games hide their lies, because your experience with them is often not a series of scenes. They can't disguise one of these quite as readily between one scene and the next if you stay with one perspective the whole game. So if a game wants you to experience a vision without it being immediately obvious that it is a vision, it'll have you seamlessly happen upon it. Maybe a glitch, maybe something vanishes, maybe you think you see something and now you're sitting there wiping your glasses. Resounding, feverish portraits you'll find in some of the nightmares we've talked about are like crashing a motorcycle face first into a shotgun blast. They should make you jump and squirm. But subtle, well-disguised moments like this whisper in Silent Hill 2 that only shows up on some playthroughs, or the chair in the background of The Shining that suddenly isn't there in between shots, carefully carve into your skin as you sleep, gently encroaching on your sanity. We'll talk more about this game in a bit, but Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is a masterful example of using both of these styles of vision. Some of the transitions into Senua's episodes in this game are just tremendously well done. It is often delicate and intentional, but it also doesn't stray away from dialing things up to 100. And what sets Senua's hallucinations and a few others in a class of their own is not just how seamlessly they move you into them, but how they make you question where they truly end. Take this scene from Hereditary. We open on a scene of a woman struggling to get to sleep. She turns over to find ants crawling on her pillow. This is not helping her get sleepy. Understandably confused and irritated, she slowly rises from the bed and begins to hunt down the source of the ants. The trail leads her carefully down the hallway and hesitantly into her son's bedroom. She has found the source of the trail, and the realization spills over her in slow, agonizing waves. The ants are feasting on her son's rotting corpse. Horror crawls across her face as her lungs choke back a blood-curdling scream.
Mom, what are you doing?
Her son is fine. She was sleepwalking. They then have a small conversation, the contents of which I won't spoil. But it quickly becomes heated. There is arguing and screaming, and suddenly they're both covered in sweat. You hear someone strike a match. Is that sweat actually gasoline? I know this came out like 7 years ago, but I only just saw it, and this part gave me goosebumps so fucking rigid that I could have grated cheese on my arm. The dream within a dream trope is a perfect way to deceive the viewer or the player. It's one of the many ways to not just stun them, but to actually make them just as apprehensive as the character in the story is. A good dream sequence takes you for a theme park ride through a character's emotions. A great dream sequence puts you in their skin and makes you live those emotions. Because now you no longer have the safety blanket or relief of the dream being over. What's to say this too isn't also a dream? It's a slippery slope if you're a writer, because you don't want to do this so much that the audience is questioning what the point even is, since it could all be a dream at this rate. Like, why get invested in any of these scenes if you're just going to keep ripping them out from under me?
I check out of the movie.
But done sparingly, it does call to question what you can trust and makes for a much more intimate experience. And it's not just subtlety, but also how grounded these are, how reasonable they are. One of the things that made the big twist in House so effective was that his hallucinations were plausible. He didn't see 100 copies of Cuddy falling from a dark abyss giggling all the way down, or hear an indescribable behemoth in an ocean under the stars. He just had interactions with people he already knew, was told things people could potentially say. There was a certain level of trust we give when we play a game or watch a show. We have to trust that perspective, that what's being shown is actually happening in that fictional reality, that it's canon, right? And by keeping the dreams and hallucinations subtle and convincing, it builds that trust when you consume them, which makes breaking it for a big twist later so damn effective. And video games have the unique opportunity to add another layer to that trust. Here's what I mean. In Hellblade, much of your experience goes something like this. With any basic task, you'll never be alone. The voices in Senua's head always chime in to whatever she is doing.
She can get up now. She can get up now. How can she get up?
And as it turns out, this is a pretty accurate portrayal of some forms of psychosis. Developer Ninja Theory worked with psychiatrists and actual patients recovering from episodes of hallucinations to build their game. If you play this and see something horrifying or incredible, it was likely inspired by what these real-life people have experienced. One of those things is the voices coming from every direction. Some close, some far, some kind, some cruel. The work they did on this alone is phenomenal and just echoes everything else we've talked about. But playing this, you still know it's all a hallucination. It's fascinating to be within this audiovisual spectacle, but how exactly does it build your trust? Well, combat in this game keeps the camera pinholed down your line of sight. You don't have nearly as much freedom as you would in a ton of other games, so when you're surrounded and being attacked from another angle, the voices are what keep you safe. They'll cue you to move, they'll help you with puzzles, they'll give you little directions.
If you hear the song of Valravn, follow it, and it will lead you to him.
Despite their maddening bullying and ridicule of Senua, they also help her sometimes.
Don't let them surround you. Don't let them get behind you.
And this is where video games can do something really special, because what does it say about you that you're relying on them? That you're giving a hallucination any amount of credence, that you're behaving as you are because the voices in your head told you to. I'm referencing a video by Leonardo da Cinci, someone who actually lives with psychosis. He makes this exact point.
In Hellblade, your only indication is one of your voices telling you to watch out. And right there, that is dangerous. Developing trust with a hallucination is the first step to everything going awry.
Some of his insights at how accurately Senua portrays his symptoms is just fascinating to hear. I really can't recommend that video enough, but this is that extra layer of trust that games can betray to make visions leave you so on edge. Disco Elysium is a game I'm playing right now, and it does this beautifully. The detective you control has so many voices in his head. They interject and try to get him to do aggressive things. They nudge you to make sexual advances and drink and smoke and indulge this guy's primal urges. And I typically turn them down, except sometimes they're kind of helpful.
I softened him up as best I could. Now it's on you to finish the job.
There's a part where he hallucinates talking to this corpse, and another when one of the voices walks him through the crime scene, and both are actually very productive to the case. There are moments when the voices make progressing the game easier. I start to think as I play this, maybe this dude works better when he's buzzed. He has amnesia after all. Maybe finding drugs or something to take the edge off would help me get to the truth quicker. Maybe I should ask this guy for a cigarette. And then when trying to bum that cigarette ruins a questioning and actually makes my job harder, I suddenly realize that I am this guy. The type of decision I just made is what got him in the situation he's in. I knew that voice wasn't real, and yet I trusted it. Why did I do that? Why did I do this? The detective asks himself. It's a deep first-person glimpse into a fictional character's psyche that is spectacularly more empathetic than just showing me that character rolling around in their sleep as we cut to their deepest fears. And again, that's not to take away from some of the simultaneously stunning and harrowing visuals we've talked about today. The opening example, despite the terror of it, is most memorable to me because of the strange peace I felt looking up at the stars. It was a surreal moment being alone with my thoughts under what I imagine the sky looks like from the other side of the galaxy. There is a unique warmth to hearing Senua's voices being kind to her.
Finish this!
There's something satisfying about the voices in Disco Elysium giving me a lead, something enchanting about the fact that although none of these visions are strictly real, Their contents are brutally honest, more conversationally real with the character than reality in many ways. There is a refreshing clarity in the fog, a welcome purity to the truth they present. Many of these come off as hellish and hard to look at, but the truth often is. Professor Paul Fletcher, one of the psychiatrists Ninja Theory consulted, clarified that hallucinations are not as simple as brain dysfunction, but that in fact,
it's not like the system shut down. It's actually an incredibly creative process. The person creates a world populated with voices and phantasms and terrors, and they're completely immersed in it. They believe in it.
And that's what makes these sequences so enamoring to me. They only exist because someone has constructed them. These characters have conceived these nightmares because very often there is something repressed, something ignored, something asleep that is begging to be woken up and acknowledged. They're funhouse mirrors that give us a reflection more voracious than anything else can, even if that reflection is not always a welcome sight. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Apologies on the voiceover, I was getting over the flu whenever I was recording this, so if I sound really nasally or gross, that's why. Let me know down below what fever dream or hallucination I didn't mention that I should have. Like the video, share it, subscribe, and if you really want to support the show as well as get a ton of bonus content like bloopers, creative input, editing live streams, and weekly updates, for $1 a month, come join my Patreon page, link in the description. Thank you very, very much to this month's featured patrons. Justin Payne, Opale, 34 Mark, Robin Fawkes, Stickman99534, Emmett James, Backlog Wizard Nick, and Kokudoru. Thanks again, y'all. Take care, sweet dreams, and have yourself a damn good one.
But whatever happens, you can't fall in love with me. Even if you think you have, it's not real.
You signed the contract. You took the blood. You fell into the dream. Only now you awaken to a nightmare. Trapped in Yharnam, a decrepit Victorian city consumed by the avarice of its denizens, the old blood, a substance of great potency and peril, ravages the population. What was sold to the people as a cure for any illness, a boon from the gods offered by the healing church, becomes the root of its downfall. Each alleyway, street and district crawling with beastly horrors. But this is merely the beginnings of this eldritch nightmare. The Great Ones, whose very existence was once buried deep below, but the very forefathers of Yharnam, are but scratching at the edges of reality. The scholars of Byrgenwerth sought to keep them at bay, while the healing church sought transcendence. For this madness to end, one must pierce the veil of the blood moon, kill the kin that hold this reality in check, and reveal the true horror that surrounds you. Only then can you truly begin to fight for your freedom, complete the contract, break the hold the Great Ones have on reality, and bring the nightmare to an end. I'm Tommy Thompson, and welcome to Design Dive on AI in Games. It's time to finally begin our descent into madness as we explore the workings of From Software's Bloodborne, a game that enriches its setting and underlying themes by framing its characters, their behaviors, and their very essence as a core part of the game's experience, and how it bears a striking similarity to the reboot of one of the most popular first-person shooters of all time. This is the third and admittedly long overdue entry in my exploration of the Soulsborne games. In our first video back in 2017, I explored the relationship between the player and Dark Souls' often challenging and sometimes frustrating reward system. A game that doesn't show its hand as explicitly as players may wish, and subsequently how it encourages you to be patient as you face off against the perils of Lordran, to listen, to wait, to act, and then reflect on what you have learned, all in an effort to decide the very fate of the Age of Fire. In our second video from 2019, we entered the land of Drangleic and explored Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, and how it takes the same core principles of the first game and subverts them in ways that support the player, while also providing an experience that is alienating and challenging to seasoned warriors. And in the time between that last episode and now, I subsequently discovered the truth of how it all works. Episode 75 of the main AI in Game series unpacks the inner workings of the original Dark Souls, and the core of these systems that have later evolved in subsequent titles. And so finally, in 2025, my journey through the Souls games continues as we enter the world of Bloodborne. Players enter the city of Yharnam, a twisted nightmare reality replete with eldritch horror, as the denizens of the city are slowly driven insane by the armies of the undead and otherworldly that descend upon them. Your role as a mysterious hunter is to bring an end to this madness. Released back in 2015, it is the fourth title by From Software that fits the mold of the Souls-like, and the one from which the moniker Soulsborne takes inspiration from. It's a little overdue, I'll admit, but I'm happy to finally get around to this playthrough. In truth, I finished playing the game in early 2024, but it's been tough to get around to writing this video. As mentioned in the previous entries of Design Dive, my interest has often lay at the intersection of how enemy AI design is built to sit in conjunction with the broader design goals of From Software's titles. The AI employed in Soulsborns have a habit of being punishing to a point of seemingly unfair to a novice, but it's often used as a means to an end, to reinforce reward systems and cycles. And so as I left Yharnam, I couldn't help but think how much the experience had reminded me, very specifically, of the first entry of id's rebooted Doom franchise from 2016. I mean, there, I said it, it's in the video title, it's in the thumbnail, I didn't want to bury the lead, we're already several minutes in. So many elements of the combat design, the enemy behaviour, but also the broader narrative design and world building felt like they sat hand in hand with Doom, which was all the more amusing to me when I remembered Bloodborne came out the year before the Doom reboot. Is this the strongest of threads on which to write an entire YouTube essay? Probably not. Does it make sense? Nah, not really. And no doubt I will veer slightly from this thesis, but it is nonetheless the one I decided this video should be structured around. Because even now, having completed both of these games, I can't help but think of one as a result of the other. Bloodborne is notable in that it's not only the first game of From's Soulsborne titles to fundamentally alter the underlying combat system, but it critically changes the pace and intensity to create something that is, to this day, still rather unique for that series. Combat is fast, often frantic, and has the player both moving quickly to deliver damage, but equally backing away with a focused intensity so as to prevent their own demise. In previous Souls games, the emphasis had often been on balancing between defense and offense. A character would typically equip a shield alongside one or two chosen weapons. While there is the option and flexibility in the character systems to allow for two-handed weapons and even dual wielding, the numerous shields on offer, combined with the broad swinging attacks of many enemies, made it such that shields were a core strategy, particularly for novice players. As discussed in my Design Dive episode on Dark Souls, learning to parry an enemy's attack, typically while holding a shield in the left hand, is a critical skill players are expected to learn, and becomes all the more critical when fighting through threshold moments of progression, such as Anor Londo, the Duke's Archives, and critically, the final boss, Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. Bloodborne denies this avenue from the very beginning, with the player expected to dual wield by default, with a standard melee weapon such as the axe in one hand and a pistol in the other. Again, there is no one way that the player is expected to build their character, and you can mix up weapon types to your heart's content, but critically the game is designed to mitigate Gate the ability to defend yourself by blocking. For one, there are literally 2 shields in the entire game. The first, found in the Cathedral Ward, is, I'd argue, nothing more than a joke, while the second, the Loch Shield, is hidden deep in the research hall of the Old Hunters DLC, which means you need to have made significant progression and developed a fair bit of skill before it will be of any use to you. It aligns with Doom's push-forward combat principle, in that it removes the ability to play defensively, and instead you must go all in on the aggression side of things. To quickly recap, as discussed both in my design dive on Doom plus my actual analysis of the game in episode 30 of the main series, id Shooter is built around a design philosophy that rewards aggression. Unlike earlier Doom games where the player could deal damage and run around finding health packs, the focus of the Doom reboot, and in turn Doom Eternal, is to have you keep fighting, keep ripping, keep tearing, and the trick to that is the Glory Kill. The Glory Kill is a short animation that finishes off an enemy in Doom, while also delivering the player health. This reinforces push-forward combat in multiple ways. The first in that it promotes mobility and keeping close to the enemy, the second in that it gives you a brief respite. The animations, while brief, are long enough to let you quickly think and focus on who to target next, plus you are invincible during the animation itself. But they serve 2 additional benefits under the hood in the eye of the designers. First, it minimises the need to place health on the map, while also avoiding a regenerative health system akin to games like Halo, which would probably be frowned upon for a franchise like Doom. But critically, for the development of a player's skill, they're not mandatory. You can kill the enemy just by shooting them, and instead it becomes a critical skill to learn when to exploit the Glory Kill or not. And so this brings it back to Bloodborne. It's funny how these 2 games explore the same idea in different ways, and Bloodborne makes 3 distinct changes to the Souls mechanics in a way that it creates its own push-forward principle. First, Bloodborne's movement is, like Doom, faster and more frenetic than its predecessors. Unlike the previous Souls games, there are no weight thresholds that dictate roll or dodge speeds, thus giving the player more agility and the ability to weave through attackers more fluidly. In addition, Bloodborne has its own form of the Glory Kill courtesy of the Visceral Attack, which isn't guaranteed to kill them, but it will do a good chunk of damage. While you can commit this attack by a backstab or stagger damage from a large attack, the main way to pull this off is to parry the enemy by shooting them during specific attack animation frames. Lastly, while the Visceral Attack is largely similar to the original system in Dark Souls, it's paired up with what is known as the Rally Potential, a mechanic where for a short time after taking damage, the hunter can regain health by bathing in the blood of their enemies by cutting through them. And so with these 3 subtle changes in how your core gameplay works, the game shifts dramatically in tone and intensity. The game is built to force you into the fight, to stick it out, do some damage, and then back out where necessary. Blocking is no longer an option. Instead, you dodge, weave, and shoot, either to put the enemy down for good, or stun them long enough to deal even more damage. But of course, what Bloodborne really has going for it is an interesting design challenge. It has to teach the player that this aggressive philosophy is the way forward, while equally ensuring the more seasoned Soul players learn to break out their established habits. Upon starting my playthrough of Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, to me it was business as usual, though this time I had to learn the nuances of these systems in what was clearly a new engine from the previous Dark Souls. But fundamentally, the underlying mechanics and dynamics of the game were largely the same. The only real thing that changed was how reward is internalized for me as the player, which was of course the topic of my entire design dive episode on the game. Again, shameless plug, go watch it. But Bloodborne is from the beginning its own beast, no pun intended, given it's having to communicate this change in underlying play, to reward players who exploit the rally mechanic, who counter and use visceral attacks by engaging in this more aggressive combat style. But how does it go about doing that? Returning to my analogy in the title and thumbnail, Bloodborne has the same problem as Doom, but it approaches it very differently. Doom of course had tutorials laced throughout it, in which the prologue mission in particular introduces the player to the idea of the Glory Kill. This of course makes sense in context of a modern reinterpretation of a classic IP, and also one that had gone through a tumultuous development cycle. Again, go watch my older Doom videos. But Bloodborne is its own thing. It's also the 4th entry of what we now call this Soulsborne series, arguably the 5th if you consider Scholar of the First Sin as something of a director's cut of Dark Souls 2, and so it's not about trying to distinguish itself from a specific IP, but a design philosophy that players have learned to love. And critically, that design philosophy is headed up by building gameplay systems and encounters that often act as silent tutorials and without explicitly declaring the dynamics of the system in its path, something that the Souls games never do. But of course, players themselves have learned the fundamentals already. Bonfires, Estus flasks, health, stamina, weapons, shields, and dodging, with weight thresholds influencing a lot of what's happening. Except of course, now everything's a little different. The lamps return you to the hunter's dream, and while you replenish your inventory from items in storage, your blood vials aren't unlimited. They're a resource you collect in the world. Your health is affected by the rally, your stamina influenced by your attire, the shields are useless, and dodging is far more fluid. So there's this design task that is laced throughout the opening hours of Bloodborne, in communicating that while a lot of this is very familiar, it is, as stated, a very different beast. So the encounters in the earlier regions of Central Yharnam and later the Cathedral District help shape a lot of how players will come to learn these dynamics. Naturally, the enemy design in Bloodborne takes a page out of the game's underlying combat philosophy, in that they're often built to be faster and more aggressive than their Dark Souls 1 and 2 counterparts, but it doesn't make them overtly aggressive by default. Rather, the game exploits it in two ways. The first is that the cooldowns between attacks are reduced, while attack cadence is sometimes increased. This ties into my analysis of the AI of the original Dark Souls, in that the game is always finding new actions to satisfy its goals at runtime, but typically there will be cooldowns and delays built into the animations to give you a bit more time to think. Bloodborne shortens a lot of these cooldown windows, meaning that enemies are often faster and forcing you to react more quickly, without fundamentally changing their speed that drastically. The second most obvious change is the sheer number of NPCs that the hunter faces off against at once. As you stroll through the Undead Burg in Dark Souls, you're lucky if you encounter more than 3 at a time, and even then that's often due to you kiting an enemy into an area, or simply not paying attention to the aggro you're generating. Bloodborne relishes any opportunity it can to drop 2, 3, 4 enemies on you at once. From the very beginning of the game, as you carve your way through Central Yharnam to the first boss on the Great Bridge, you'll find yourself facing off multitudes at once, be it the patrol moving through the streets, the crowd gathered around the burning werewolf, or past the ogre near the stairwell of the Great Bridge. And so thus far, the faster paced combat, the larger numbers of NPCs in action, all of it forces the player into learning the dynamics of the game, and critically how they differ from previous Soulsborne titles. But there's still a chance that it's not quite sinking in yet, that the player hasn't quite figured it out, or learned what the game is trying to communicate. And so it rounds it off with the wolf beasts that patrol the Great Bridge. These enemies are big, fast, aggressive, and symbolise the feral nature of Bloodborne's combat. For many a new player, they are the first real test of your skill, and in many respects are best defeated using the rally system, pushing in, doing damage, aiming for a parry and a visceral attack to finish them off. And in truth, it's something you need to start learning, and quickly, as the bosses are not going to give you any respite. The boss battles of the original Dark Souls are typically against large, demonic, brutish creatures. From the very first boss in the Asylum Demon, through the Gaping Dragon, Chaos Witch Quelaag, the Iron Golem, and Great Grey Wolf Sif, the game revels in larger, often lumbering monstrosities that you need to navigate around while avoiding their broad, often devastating attacks. However, Bloodborne's enemy designs take the faster-paced, more aggressive gameplay style and inject it into many of their boss designs, aligning more with the likes of Dragon Slayer Ornstein, the Capra Demon, and critically the Great Knight Artorias. Developed as part of the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, an expansion complete with the marvellous Chester NPC who bears something of a resemblance to the hunters in Yharnam, the Abyss Walker is arguably a reflection of the changing creative direction that From Software had envisaged for Bloodborne. Artorias is fast, highly agile, and forces the player to constantly be on the move. Unlike other bosses where you will try and hold out against certain attacks with shield raised, or simply run away from them until the broader attack is cleared, Artorias forces you to keep the character in your sights while also staying on the move and trying to parry where possible. This philosophy is at the core of many of Bloodborne's bosses, starting with the first 2 in Central Yharnam, the Cleric Beast on the Old Bridge, and later Father Gascoigne at the Tomb of Oedon. When compared to the first bosses in Dark Souls, the Asylum Demon and the Taurus Demon, it sets a very different tone. The Cleric Beast is in many respects similar to the Asylum Demon, but faster, more aggressive, and leaving you less time to react and recover. Both encourage the use of dodging to keep them at bay, but the use of the rally system to swallow a hit to then get health back as you lean into an attack becomes all the more relevant against the cleric beast. It becomes such a central conceit of fighting bosses in a way that is really satisfying, in that many will leave just enough time for you to get those hits in before you need to back off, or have parry windows that you can exploit more readily. Or in the case of the cleric beast and larger bosses like it, you trigger a stagger by damaging specific limbs, typically their head. This allows for the visceral attack to readily turn the tide. You see this so frequently in Bloodborne even as the bosses get larger and more monstrous, be it the blood-starved beast in Vicar Amelia to the smaller, more nimble enemies like the Shadows of Yharnam. Seriously, screw those guys, so annoying. In my original Dark Souls video I talked about how so much of what's happening is about developing understanding through patience, whereas Bloodborne sort of encourages the opposite, in that holding ground is no longer as effective and you need to more aggressively chip away at an enemy, but still know when to pull back. You're still holding the ground, but the way in which you're doing it has evolved. And perhaps the most interesting is that there's a clear tipping point where it's expected that you have taken Bloodborne's philosophy on board. And so it's with the standoff against Rom the Vacuous, the pivotal mid-game boss of Bloodborne, that things truly begin to take shape. As those who've played the game will know, it's not so much the design of the Rom boss encounter itself that is the critical inflection point, but how the game evolves from here on out. Seriously, this is a spoiler, don't keep watching if you don't want to know. Rom prevented the true nature of the Blood Moon from affecting the denizens of Yharnam, and now all is revealed as the city is gripped in chaos, and the eldritch horrors that have been there the whole time can be seen looking down and picking off the screaming survivors below. Yahar'gul, the unseen village, is the moment where the game truly tests whether you've taken on board everything it has communicated thus far, as Chime Maidens enable enemies to continually respawn without giving you blood echoes to harvest. It's a point where the difficulty spikes, given the game is now testing the player and how well they've absorbed the underlying lessons of Bloodborne. You need to smash through everything as fast as possible and then ensure that none of it comes back to haunt you again. Now critically, these moments arise in many a game in which it's clear you're moving into the next real phase and everything kicks up a notch. That's nothing novel, it's just pacing. But it's not often I can think of a game where it really accelerates that expectation of skill mastery. The original Dark Souls arguably had its pivotal moment in the death of the Iron Golem and the arrival at Anor Londo, though that always struck me as more of a transition to a new form of skill mastery, rather than the expectation you've really got to grips with the underlying design philosophy completely. You arrive at Anor Londo after pushing through Sen's Fortress, which is arguably the real threshold point in that it's checking whether you've learned to watch for traps, to aggro enemies appropriately, to be mindful of your surroundings. But Anor Londo is a different playstyle, as you figure out how to deal with the Sentinels, the largest regular enemy you come across, plus dealing with the smaller knights running amok in the castle. To this day, Anor Londo feels like the continuation of an education, rather than the assessment of your overall understanding. Bringing it back to Doom, because why not, I always figured the 2016 game had a similar pivotal point, which is the Argent Tower, which is of course part of the underlying pacing, but again I kind of see these two games as one. The destruction of the Argent Tower leads to the first full level in Hell, the Candigar Sanctum, which really starts to push the game forward in encounter design while also adding new weapons that allow you to control the flow of combat in new ways. Admittedly, you're going to take less time in getting there, given I can beat Doom 2016 about 4 times in the time it takes me to complete everything in Bloodborne, but it's a clear delineation of what once was and what now is, and the game has largely stopped holding your hand. It's something I don't think Doom Eternal ever successfully achieved, in that it adds layer upon layer to the game's dynamics and expects you to learn to embrace it. This is of course the focus of my Design Dive episode on Doom Eternal, in which I argue that the second entry of this reboot series, while fun, builds too many systems that lack variety, and ultimately force the player not to reach those learning thresholds to enable their own gameplay style, but rather funnel them into only one acceptable means by which to beat the game. Okay, this weird thesis is almost finished, but I still have one final argument to present, and that's how each game establishes tone. Both Bloodborne and Doom have this shift in their narrative framing that is, in context of their established series, almost identical in that the player character is far more defined as an individual, and that enables player empowerment while also retaining their semblance of mystery. Returning to the earlier entries of both series, you're a silent protagonist. You're also largely inconsequential to the broader narrative of either. The Doom guy is but one surviving space marine who has to fight his way through monsters in order to survive, while the chosen undead of Dark Souls is simply the latest in a long line of unfortunate souls who have embarked on the quest to ring the Bell of Awakening. The chosen undead is truly a speculative title at best, and one that you only truly earn at the very end as you decide the fate of the Age of Fire. After all, there is an implication throughout, courtesy of the messages of other players and their phantoms appearing in the game, that you are but one of many chosen undead, and fingers crossed, you're just the most chosen that will ultimately deliver on the promise. But in both of the games in question, you're now more largely defined by the world around you and how you fit into the broader narrative, and that's reinforced by the world that is then subsequently built around you. The Doom guy is now the Doom Slayer, an arbiter of rage that has torn his way through hell and back, to the point he is not just known by the denizens of hell, he is the one thing they fear more than anything else. Meanwhile, Bloodborne excels in establishing a similar tone in ways that no other Soulsborne game has achieved. It's safe to say that the world itself, courtesy of the environment art team, is a fantastic setting. The city of Yharnam is a gothic monstrosity, a spiralling mess of sprawling streets, upper walkways, narrow passageways, secret elevators, filthy tunnels, and much more besides. The city, this time inspired much more from Victorian-era architecture from cities like Prague and Edinburgh, compared to the more medieval influences from much of Dark Souls, helps set a tone that is less mystical than its predecessors. And when you look at it a little deeper, beyond the differences in artistic style and presentation, there is much more going on that establishes Yharnam as a place. It paints a world more dark and foreboding, and one where life still thrives, often in monstrous form, rather than the ancient and almost decrepit lands of Lordran or the kingdom of Drangleic. Like the Doomslayer, the Hunter is now a name on the tongue of the people, not just the enemies you face off against in Yharnam, arguably the first enemies in the Soulsborne series that actually speak. But also the many citizens hiding behind the doors of homes throughout the city.
I don't reckon you're from round here. Well, stuck outside on a night of the hunt. Oh, you poor, poor thing.
It's far more subtle than Doom, because, well, it's Doom, but the implication you are feared and even reviled for what you and your kind bring to the city is one that really fleshes out the world building. And so yes, ultimately each game pulls off a narrative framing that does a more successful job of placing you in the boots of the protagonist than other games in their respective franchises, and yes, I'm looking at you, Doom Eternal. I can safely say when I started writing this episode, the premise of comparing two very distinct, very different games to one another was not the focus. But as mentioned, when I think of one of these games, I can't help but think of the other. Each of them is an evolution of their underlying design concept, and are working to fundamentally change the philosophy baked into their lineage. Each has its priorities, its own goals, but the similarities seem readily apparent to me, to a point that they both sit quite comfortably in the same space in my mind. For in each instance, it's a cycle. As death looms, blood demands to be spilled, our protagonists rip and tear, their attacks visceral and swift, pushing forward, a rallying cry, all in an effort to awaken from an unending nightmare.
Ah, boy. Ah, boy. I think this is it.
What's happening?
I'm terribly sorry. It's my mistake.
What is wrong with you people?
Stand by all systems. Now approaching destination. Prepare landing sequence. Control operation normal.
The thing's bigger than the Earth.
Roger
Oh.
for initial orbit.
Am I sure I ate? Did I eat today?
5, 4.
All right. Time machine adventure. You guys ready to learn?
Well, ever since the brain blobs turned me into a dino droid, folks have been calling me Dexter. You? I'm gonna call you rocket scientist.
This is for big kids.
Now you want to know how this thing works, rocket scientist?
I'm a big kid.
Uh-oh. Looks like we have company on this channel. Me name is Harry the Harrier, fool. I come from Zeltoid with the aliens to rule.
Weird Al Yankovic.
I've learned.
The arrows at the sides of the map allow you to move the map left and right. Beneath the map is the map button.
What is that
which
on the
brings
left?
up
That looks
the
like an
map
organ.
and the gruntometer. Anytime you wish to end the game, click the Q button.
Okay, so I have 24 hours. Is that what that means? 24 hours to save each dino? Q? Did you just make me quit the game? Everyone just said Q, so I pressed it. I thought it was going to be quality, like those old Flash games. Remember you could press the button, it could look like shit? I used to have to do that on my computer. Alright, well, let's go. Let's play WoW.
Okay, here's the deal. If you...
Alright, we're going to kick some brain. Okay, so let's just do it. What?
Which dinosaur would you like to review?
No, I think we just go in. I think we just go for it. Alright, map. Let's kick some brain. Let's go. Okay.
Pretty soon I'm gonna have to start making up clues just to keep myself interested.
What does this stuff mean? Does this stuff matter at all? Alright, I'm just gonna go down. I'm gonna go all the way down. Oh! A Triceratops! Look, guys, look, a Triceratops!
According to my sensory circuits, the brain blobs are not pursuing that dinosaur.
Why not?
Continue your search for the dinosaur in danger.
A chump like you couldn't possibly defeat me.
Actually, you're probably that's the easiest enemy on Earth to defeat. You're squishy, you're small, you don't have any arms or legs, you just have eyes. I could sprint punch you, and your screen would just go black.
Whoa! With a geyser like that, you could practically start your own national park right after the ground cools down.
Okay. All right. How do I stop this from happening? Cool. But that's not what we're looking for, though. I only have 19 hours. It's 30 minutes for each one, right?
Bad move, RS. That lodestone is sending our power pack into a downward spiral.
Don't touch it?
Bad move,
What is it? I shouldn't touch it?
Real heartbreaker, Dingleberry. You're looking for clues in all the wrong places.
Okay. There it is.
That's not what a dinosaur sounds like.
According to my sensory circuits, the brain blobs are not pursuing that dinosaur. Continue your search for the dinosaur in danger.
Do we even know what these things sounded like? How do we even know that? We just wouldn't. How are we ever going to know what that dinosaur sounded like? What if they talked?
A chump like you couldn't possibly defeat me.
Yeah, that's when you walk up with the crossbow and you